With the Snare Saturday series, most of the videos are me showcasing different drums. That way you can hear for yourself if it would be a good fit in your collection. There's even some videos where I'll compare two drums back to back, or even do a blind test to see if you can hear the differences and to determine if that drum really does fit your needs. But there is one thing that I've never covered so far: how to maintain your snare drum. So in this Snare Saturday video, I'm going to be going over 5 things you need to look over to make sure that your snare drum can be a workhorse for a really long time. For those who are unfamiliar with the channel, hi, welcome. My name is Nick Costa and I am a drummer from Philly, PA. And as drummers, we all love snare drums. And there are a few that we always gravitate towards for whatever situation we are playing in. But regardless of being a vintage or modern drum, you have to maintain it to make sure that you can always use it as a workhorse for a really long time. Now, before we dive into this video, make sure you hit the subscribe button as well as the bell icon. That way you're notified of any additional content that I upload to the channel. Let's get started with the very first thing, which is the most common, the drum heads. Of course, you need to make sure that you have proper drum heads on your drum. And like any drum, you also need to make sure you're replacing the bottom head, even though you are not striking it with a stick. Looking at this from a physics perspective, even though you are only striking the top head, that chamber of air that is going through the drum is pushing down on the bottom head. Over time, that does tend to stretch out and wear out, and you're not going to get as much tone out of the bottom head, at least with snare drum response in this case, and it can start to make your drum sound a little bit choked out, or make your snare wires not have as sharp of a response as they would with a fresh head. Now, when it comes to the top head, there are various options out there. Single ply heads give you the most resonance. Double ply heads give you more durability but control the overtones a little bit. And then there are a gamut of different types of heads depending on if you want a single ply or double ply head. Some have reinforcement rings. Some also have rings around the exterior of the head, once again, to control overtones. But when it comes to the top head, if it is a coated head and you notice that the coating is starting to come off, that is a good sign that it is time to replace the head. And just like any other drum head, if you are starting to get divots or dents in the head, that is also a sign that it is time to replace it. Now, while you are replacing both the top and bottom head on your snare drum, it's a perfect time to check other components of the drum and really make sure that you clean off the bearing edges of the top and the bottom. Even if you are a neat freak and you want to make sure your drums are in pristine condition all of the time, things like stick shavings, dirt, even dust can start to build up between the drum head and the bearing edge. And you want to make sure that when you put a new head on, the only thing that is making contact with that bearing edge is the drum head itself. Now, while the heads are off, it is a great time to check out the tension rods and the lugs. And once again, it doesn't matter if it's a vintage drum or a modern drum. When you take the drum apart, you will see some of them have globs of grease either on the tension rods themselves or inside the receiver tubes of the lugs. Now, although this lubricates everything and reduces friction, those giant globs of grease also attract dirt, which in return gets locked up in the threading of your tension rods and can lead to things malfunctioning. Now, you don't have to do this every time you replace the heads on your drums, but once in a while, you want to make sure that you are applying some kind of lubricant to the tension rods or the receiver tubes of the lugs. And my go-to is any type of dry lubrication, because this puts a protective coating on whatever you are applying it to, and it ends up being dry. And the reason why I want this over something like a grease or a lubricant that's wet is that those two things can start to attract dirt and grime. A dry lubrication will not. And at the end of the day, there really isn't a right or wrong way to lubricate those components to your drums. So if you are a fan of white lithium grease, that works too. If you want something that is more petroleum based, that's fine as well. But making sure that the tension rods and the receiver tubes of your lugs have some kind of lubrication on them. This is something that you could do every other year. If you wanted to do it every year, you could, but it's not really needed. That will make sure that all of the components will work without failing. Moving on to the next item, snare wires. Now, if you are a fan of vintage drums like I am, you may also be a fan of vintage snare wires. But if you have decade-old snare wires that are getting really tight and loose by engaging and disengaging the snare wires, they may end up looking like this over time, where some of those wires are really stretched out while the other ones aren't. This is going to produce a lot of sympathetic buzzing when you are playing your snare drum, which might not work in certain playing situations. Even if you look for other vintage wires, you'll see that some of them start to stretch out more than others as well. So for a couple bucks, you might as well get a new set of snare wires. And there are countless companies out there providing different types of snare wires depending on the sound that you are going for. But let's say for vintage drums, however, the strands were usually a lot smaller than the ones that are currently out. That is why there are companies like Canopus out there who are making vintage wires both in a 16 and 20 strand configuration and both in a standard and plated option, so you can find a set of snare wires that are as close as possible to the vintage ones. Then, of course, if you have a modern drum, you can put a set of Canopus vintage wires on there, but there are other options out there as well, like the backbeat models. So if you are noticing that your snare has an interesting buzz to it, or that the snare wires are sounding like they're a bit unresponsive, if you've replaced the heads and they still sound that way, might be time for you to look into replacing the snare wires. I have released a couple Snare Saturday videos where I put a bunch of different snare wires on a few different snare drums. I've put links to those videos in the description below, so feel free to check those out to hear how the snare wires affect the sound of the drums. Speaking of snare wires, that one component on a snare drum that can make or break it, the throw off, and then its friend, the butt plate. Always make sure that you are inspecting the snare throw off to make sure that the lever isn't bent. The fine-tuned knob at the top can be adjusted and doesn't become loose over time. And then all of the components that are on the back side of it that allow you to engage and disengage the snare wires, making sure that there isn't a bunch of dirt, grease, and grime built up on them so it doesn't fail on you while you're playing. If you have an older drum and the lever is bent, or any of the components are starting to fail on your throw off, there are countless kits out there that allow you to replace the throw off and even the butt plate. So if you have a Ludwig drum, Ludwig makes the P88 AC kit. This comes with a throw off and butt plate that you can apply to any Ludwig drum, and it might even work on some non-Ludwig drums as well. If you are unsure, however, there are other companies out there that make really reliable throw offs. Some of my favorites are from Trick. Even the indie throw-offs are really good as well. And although some of those companies have a set distance between the top and bottom mounting screws for your throw-off, some of them have an adjustable set as well that allow you to adjust accordingly so it fits on your drum. Now, if your throw-off is starting to lock up a little bit and it's not working that smoothly, you can take that dry lubricant that I was recommending for your tension rods and receiver tubes of your lugs and apply this to the throw off to make it function nice and smooth. Simply spray this on all of the moving components of the throw off, engage and disengage the lever, turn the fine-tune knob around a little bit just to get some of this into all of those components, and you will start to see that that throw off starts to work a whole lot better than it was before. Now, the fifth and final thing that you need to look into are the bearing edges. However, I feel that there's not much you can do to a bearing edge except for cleaning it. Now, there are companies out there that make what they call a bearing edge conditioner, which just kind of looks like chapstick branded as bearing edge conditioner, and maybe you use something like that and have had success with it. However, the way that I see it, you are applying something that is now going between the bearing edge and the drum head itself, which is not going to get you the most accurate contact between those two surfaces, which you really need. So when the drum heads are off the drum, check the bearing edges and look for any peaks or valleys. And it doesn't matter what brand you are playing, if it's a vintage drum or a modern drum. It is super rare to find a bearing edge that is 100% flat, because every drum is going to be exposed to various climates, humidity levels, and if you're somebody who plays rim shots like I do, that can affect the bearing edge if you are hitting really, really, really hard. Put heads on the drum and see if it's difficult to tune. If it is difficult to tune, you might want to consider getting the bearing edges recut. And when I say recut, it doesn't mean that it has to have a brand new profile cut into the drum. Any reputable drum shop or drum builder who does recut bearing edges or condition them can put the drum on a granite stone, and as long as there's sandpaper on it, they can turn the drum to flatten it out to make sure there's a nice smooth profile on it. If you are looking to get this done, whoever you reach out to, ask them how they work on reconditioning or recutting bearing edges. If they are using any type of handheld device, I would recommend finding somebody else to do this for you. Because even though that handheld device might be able to get some accuracy, a simple hand movement is going to adjust what is getting corrected on the drum. So just keep that in mind. Now here's a bonus thing to add. If you have a snare drum that does detune over time as you play, then you might want to consider finding out ways to make sure that drum stays in tune. One of the options out there is the bolt type by Canopus drums. It's two washers that go above and below the metal washer on your tension rod. That way when you apply tension, it holds everything in place. There are also a ton of different lug lock options out there that are similar to the bolt type that just make sure that if the tension rod is starting to back out, it catches so it doesn't detune. There are also components out there that have the locking mechanisms already built into the tension rod, like the bolt type from Canopus drums. If you have tension rods where the washers don't come off, you can just replace the entire tension rod where everything is already built in. Now, if you wanted to get a bit adventurous, you could use some kind of thread lock that you would apply to your tension rods. And if you are a fellow car enthusiast out there, you know about blue and red Loctite. The only thing that I can say is make sure that any thread lock that you want to put on your tension rods, you are using the one that is the most minimum locking. Stay away from red Loctite because you need heat to apply to get those to come back out, and blue Loctite might just be a bit too much. If you did want to give any type of thread lock a try, just so you know, you are doing this at your own risk, and there is potential for things to get locked up and malfunction. So if you don't want to risk it, use something like a dry lubrication to make sure everything works, and then use things that are made by drum companies like the bolt tights here to make sure that your tension rods don't back out while you're playing them. So those are the 6 different things that you always want to routinely go over to make sure that your snare drum can be a workhorse for a long time. And I'd like to know, what are some things that you do to condition and make sure that your snare drum is always performing at its highest caliber? Make sure that you leave those things in the comment section below, letting me know. If you are looking for some of the components that I mentioned in this video, like the dry lubricant, the throw off and butt plate combination, new drum heads, even new snare wires, I've put affiliate links to some of my favorites in the description below. That way you can get what you need to make sure your snare drum works in tip-top shape. Also, if you have any other additional questions on any of the things that I mentioned in this video, or maybe some things that I didn't bring up, You can leave that in the comment section as well, and I will try my best to answer them. If you enjoyed this video and you want to check out some of the earlier videos in the Snare Saturday series, I've put a link to the playlist in the description below. I'll also have it come up right here to make it a bit easier for you. Finally, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure that you give it a thumbs up. That not only makes it easier for others to find it, it is a free and easy way to support the channel. And that is it. Thank you so much for checking out this video on 5 essential tips to maintaining your snare drum. And until next time, see you later.